This is Lynda Wright, librarian at Randolph-Macon College. Welcome to Macon Memories. Today is April the 4th, 2008, and today I'm here with Coach Ted Keller and Coach Helmut Werner, and I'll let them introduce themselves and talk about their time at Randolph-Macon.
This is Helmut Werner, former soccer coach, swimming and tennis coach, as well as being in administration as a chairman of the department and athletic director later on.
My name is Ted Keller, and I'm the former track and assistant football coach at Randolph-Macon, also head football coach, athletic director for 14 years, and golf coach.
Ted, you and I both have served the college for many, many years. I'm not exactly sure how long you were here, but when I retired, I think I had put in 43 years. You also had one additional point of interest because you were as a student here. So I thought it'd be interesting if you tell us maybe how you got here.
That's correct, Helmut. I enrolled in Randolph-Macon in 1949. I came here as a result of the influence of my high school principal, Garland Quarles, and Jim Miller, who was a sophomore and my first cousin. My tenure here was from 49 to 53. I majored in history, and I'm sort of minored in coaching because that's what I wanted to do when I got out of college, teach and coach at a high school level. I did play football and baseball here. I had 8 letters. I roomed at Mary Brandt's dormitory. I might tell you this. My first 6 weeks at Randolph-Macon were not too good. In fact, I was very homesick. But as I got to know the people more and got interested in the athletic program, surprisingly, I didn't even want to go home in the summer. I wanted to stay here all the time. That's how much I love Randolph-Macon. I did join the KA fraternity at Macon, and one of the stories that I have in regard to that is the fact that in the pledging period, they sometimes took their pledges out on the road. They painted them up. They gave them no money, straggly clothes, and made them find their way back to campus. Well, this particular freshman year, they took myself and another student out on the road one night, 11 p.m., and told us to find the way back. We slept on a haystack that night. We caught a ride in a truck that early next morning to Route 1. We finally found our way back to campus at about 1 o'clock. I went into the dining hall, and the first person I saw was a professor whose class I was supposed to attend an hour ago. And he just looked at me and said, "I know what you've been up to." Anyway, that wasn't a very exciting experience seeing him. And another thing in regard to our early days at Randolph-Macon was the fact that we had a great rivalry with Hampton-Sydney. And at that time, we were supposed to wear beanie hats. And we could get rid of the beanie hats if we beat Hampton-Sydney in football. And the rivalry at that time was really vicious. We sent people to their campus to paint up their campus. They had a big eagle on campus. We painted that up. Sometimes they caught us and shaved our heads, and they came here and painted up our campus, and sometimes we caught them and shaved their heads. So after a while, the freshmen were asked to stay up 24/7 for that whole week and sort of provide security for the campus. So that's one of the things that happened during that period of time. Then I left school, went into the Marine Corps, and finally returned as an assistant coach in 1958. Mutt, I know you didn't come to school here. However, I would like to know what your hiring process was like here at Randolph-Macon.
Well, I tell you, compared to today's procedures, there was no hiring process at all. I came on campus to talk to Hugh Stevens, who was the athletic director at that time, and he and I met probably for an hour, 2 hours. He showed me all about the campus, and after that, I'm not sure whether he made a phone call to Dr. Moreland or not, and Dr. Moreland met with me and offered me a salary of $3,800, which was non-negotiable, but it was a raise of where I came from Amelia High School. And the only other thing is, at that time, the college provided housing. I'm sure you got the same, opportunity to use it.
That's correct.
And they would do they would cut the grass for you and everything else, and you had a whole house for maybe at first $48-some, I think, and that was an extra perk, so to speak. But that's how I got to the college. It was very simple, straightforward, and I've been here. I was there at 62 and stayed for 43 years.
Well, let me add one little anecdote here about my hiring. Paul Severin was the head football coach, and he decided to go into the insurance business, and it left an opening in the athletic department as one of the football coaches. And so Hugh Stevens and Joe McCutcheon, who was elevated to the head coaching job, came up to see me in Fairfax High School. And they told me they had an opening and they wanted to hire me for that opening. And I know when Hugh mentioned the fact, says, Ted, I would like to. And I said, I'll take it before he even finished the sentence. I really wanted to coach in college, and I got the job a lot sooner than I thought.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, Ted, because I know today, again, the coaches have changed so much at our college and other colleges. But when you and I were hired, it wasn't just coaching football, as we said in our introduction. We had other duties. Do you mind to expand on those for a second?
Well, that's correct. Well, we did have a lot of other duties. Usually we're maybe a head coach in one sport, assistant in another. We all taught physical education. We had a lot of interaction with the students, and we also taught a class. I think I taught a class in football and track at that time. So we did have an interaction with the students.
Well, in my case, as I said in the introduction, I was an assistant swimming coach at first at Joe McCutcheon, then later became head coach. I took over the tennis for the spring, and as you mentioned, we all, I think, taught basically 2 regular PE classes, which later on changed into a class for coaches that I taught till the end of my career here. The one thing that I noticed when I got here to Randolph-Macon, Ted, we had one of what they call the first gym in the South. Since then, we've had 4 different facilities. Would you mind maybe speaking about the first 2, since you, not trying to say that you were here when the first one was built, but talked about the first 2 facilities for me.
Well, you're exactly right. I was not here when the first one was built, but we did have a progression of 4 gymnasiums called the Old Gym, Alumni Gym, Crenshaw, and the Brock Center. The Old Gym, as I can remember, was at the same place where our fountain is now. And this gym was small, very inadequate, maybe adequate at that time, but you could almost shoot a basketball from one end to the other. It was so small. But it was a relic on campus. And when they were building the other gym, one of the things that the alumni didn't want was to tear down the really old gym. In fact, at one time, when they were getting ready to tear it down, somebody climbed up on top of the roof and painted a sign and the sign said, "Save me," so that everybody could see it. But eventually it was torn down, and we eventually got to Alumni Gym. Now, this gym was built in the 1920s, I believe, and it was small. But as far as I'm concerned, when I got to school here, that's where we played basketball, because the Crenshaw Gym wasn't built until 1964. But Alumni Gym was small, great crowds, had a track around it, and we go back to the old saying, students were hanging from the rafters when they watched the games.
Well, I remember, of course, the second one you're referring to, Alumni Gym. I came in '62, but right shortly thereafter we started planning for the third gym on campus, which is known as the Crenshaw Gymnasium. And I was involved, as well as you were, in the planning of that particular building. It looked like a box, and we were promised by architects and engineers that the air conditioning would be good in the summer and the heat would be good in the winter, but it was just the opposite. It was cold in the winter and also hot in the summer. No windows, which later on were added. But that facility was still the art of the time when we first had it. I can remember back to the other gym in the Alumni, where we had one office for all 5 coaches in it, and you got to know each other pretty well in that particular time. But then we will, I know, talk about coeducation a little bit later. But then we also built another gym after Crenshaw, and it's always been referred to as an athletic building, but actually it really is mostly a recreation building. But it's the Brock Center, and now this is an outstanding facility. But as I indicated, it's mostly for recreation, and all the students use it, of course, but it's not for athletics. As well as the old gyms that passed us, Ted, you and I were here so long, we surpassed a lot of the presidents as well. And I thought this might be a good time to maybe get your input on what you thought of each of the presidents that we served under. And I'll respond and see whether you left anything out.
Well, first thing I got to know is the statute of limitations over. You and I did, I guess, sort of outlive 4 presidents: Dr. Moreland, Luther Wright, Liddell Payne, and Rusty Martin. I'll comment maybe on the first 2, and I'll leave the last 2 for
Thanks
for your comments. Dr. Moreland was the president of Randolph-Macon College, I believe, for 28 years, and that's really a long tenure. He was one of the, I guess, most likable people that I have ever known to serve as a college president. He was always very positive. He came to a lot of your practices. He did a lot of things for a lot of people, and I guess you'd call him a people person. And of course, that's the kind of person that I like. And the college moved, I think, pretty well under him. Next came Luther Wright, who was a Randolph-Macon alumnus and a lawyer. And as I understand it, he was on a committee to recommend the next president. And in the end, bottom line is that the committee got together and offered him the job, which was kind of unusual. But I might say that I got along, with all the presidents, pretty well. I guess if I have to pick a favorite, maybe Dr. Moreland, who was a very people person, was, probably my favorite. But I think all of them did good things for the college.
Well, I, of course, remember both of those gentlemen as well. But I would say, it's not a matter of favorites, but the one that I thought made a lot of changes at the college was Liddell Payne. here came out of the West, the dean and the new president. And the one thing I remember, first of all, when he went to meetings and staff meetings as well as college functions, all of a sudden we got to drink wine. This was quite a change, being at a Methodist college at that time, but I was not opposed to that at all. But Liddell Payne, I thought, was an understanding president. Later on, when I was an administrator, I worked pretty well with him and the Dean Garris, and I thought they did what they could for the college. The college financially at the beginning, I think, was in dire straits, but as we went along, I think we got more and more. The endowment grew, I know, and it probably had an effect on us. But the presidents really didn't change the tone that much of the department. We were always hoping that here comes the savior who would come in and be all favored for sports and athletics. We never found him. I think we have to find him in the next life of ours. And then the last president, I really didn't get to know Rusty Martin as well as the others, and but he was there and showed an interest in the college. But the first three had more of a meaning to me at least. Ted, I know one of the major changes, and this is where I think these presidents and all probably had an effect. One of the major changes at the college was when it went to coeducation. You know, for over 100 and some years, you had a male institution, which we haven't really mentioned, which is okay. And all of a sudden now the Board of Trustees and the college decided that they wanted to have females on campus. And that caused some concern to various people. You have any recollections of that time?
Well, let me talk about one thing here that maybe we sort of skipped over, and that was before we get to this, and that was the campus and its athletic facilities, and maybe how they've changed. I know back when I was going to school, and a little bit later, 1958, when I came to Randolph-Macon, we had probably between 500 and 600 students, and we're all males. And now we have 1150, and the percentage is in favor of the females. And we had very little space. And when the females came to the college, we still had very little space. I know our football practice field was located as where now the Brock Center is. And on our regular field, our regular football field was partly on the baseball field. In fact, first base was inside the playing field. And it seemed like everybody played on each other's fields. Their field space was really inadequate, I think. Didn't have many fields across the tracks. I think we had tennis courts across there, but hardly any at all. Now we have a lot of our fields are across the tracks. And I believe soccer did not have their separate field at that time. That there were a lot of, there were a lot of fields, I think, that each other played on, and soccer was one of them. Now football is off the baseball field, and we did have a press box erected, the Chinnery press box, which was a nice facility at that time, and it's still a decent facility, although not up to modern standards. Getting to the co-ed side of it, I believe in 1971, 72, along that area, it was when the co-eds came in. If I'm not mistaken, I think that first year, because we started late, we only had about 50. So we didn't have very many at that time. Next year, we had a lot bigger crowd of co-eds. One of the things I think that really bothered the people in the athletic department was the fact that space and funding, there was not that much additional funding, and the college did not provide enough space for the new sports that were coming in. So I think we had some growing problems right at first. Rachel Anderson was the, I guess, pioneer of the athletic department. She was here as the physical education director, and she was the person who started the new women's sports, and I believe probably tennis and basketball were two of the first sports that were started. We didn't have a lot of trouble right at first with the space, but I know this, that the guys, they've been having their own situation for a long period of time, and then when somebody new comes in, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult. How do you feel about the time that the co-eds came in?
Well, it's basically, I agree with what you said, but to me it was two things. The space part of it is one of it. We had no offices for them. We had no locker rooms for them. The shower situation had to change drastically. Women were not used to showering at that time, particularly, I don't know about today, in groups, and so you had to do a lot of construction to cover that area. And the area of the finances, the college was never in abundance of money where we could do whatever we wanted to. We could do what we needed to do. So when they added women, as you said, the funding wasn't appropriate, I don't think. And so the men looked at it as somewhat, maybe we were sharing money that we had before instead of getting additional money. And that is, if there was any bad feelings, that is where the bad feelings were about. And the other thing is, women's athletics has changed so much in the last 20 years. In the beginning, women athletics was looked upon a little bit more like recreation, opposed to athletics where you had keen competition, and getting sweaty and all that type of thing. That wasn't a word that women used as a rule. And so once the women acclimated themselves sort of what the athletics became today, then I don't think there are any problems. Everybody was pulling for each other. And today you have outstanding facilities. I'm not sure about outstanding, but good facilities for both. And the funding is not too bad either. Anything else in that area that you have?
Well, do you want to talk about Title IX now? Does that seem appropriate
it's good.
At this time? Title IX came into being, I guess, back in the 70s, of course, when the women, were introduced to Randolph-Macon. And basically what that said was that you had to give equal opportunity to the women as much as the men. Now, if a school had a football program, which probably included maybe 90 to 100 people, in order to give equal opportunity, this sometimes became very difficult. And basically what Title IX was is that if you had so many men and so many women in school, you take that percentage, and then you got to provide an opportunity for that percentage of women to play in athletics, and also create a budget that is somewhat similar. Doesn't have to be on the penny, but it's got to be similar. So we didn't have that much problem as far as equal opportunity. But where we did have a problem, though, I think, is the sharing of facilities that were kind of inadequate, and who got what time in the gym, because now you have two basketballs and volleyball playing in the gym, sometimes in the same period of time. You have two soccers. Lacrosse came into being, and so you had some sports that were taking up the same space. And I think at first from the guys' standpoint, they wanted to keep their own times and their own space like they wanted, but eventually we worked that out so that everybody got equal access. But it did create some difficulties at that particular time. Don't you agree, Matt?
Yeah, I think I do. I think the one thing that at the time that Title IX was sort of, let's use the word, enforced on campus a little bit more, the faculty probably thought we were against women's having equal rights, but it really had to do with funding, and it wasn't the department that was controlling the funding. The funding came from above us, and so that is, once we took care of that, as you mentioned, when I was, for instance, hired as chairman of the athletic department, Liddell Payne and Garris told me that my main duty was to bring the women's athletic department up to the men's program as far as winning programs go. And so we had to sit down, and I remember in particular Carol LaHaye, the basketball coach, and she and I had some good meetings. And she said, listen, if you want me to operate the same as the men, I need the same coaching situation, full-time coach, and so on. And as you said, the biggest things that were worked out were the area of the times of practice and so on. And then shortly thereafter, we had a women's program that was very successful. In particular, Jeff Burns, who was my assistant, he was also the women's soccer coach. He took the women's basketball team to like 5-6 national championships and finished very high. I think maybe once.
You're talking about the NCAAs.
NCAAs,
yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And he finished like in the top 4 one year, I think. So the women, in particular basketball and the soccer, did very well after we got things straightened out, as you mentioned earlier. The other thing, Ted, that is sort of in the same time frame, I think. When I first came, there were 2 divisions in the colleges in the country. One was a college division, the other was the university division. Usually the university division where the bigger schools and all the small schools were thrown into a college division. You tell me when we get to you at what year that may have occurred, the change where football was put into what they referred to as Division III, and how they decided who stayed behind. Because I know the college at Randolph-Macon had some discussions, serious discussions, and some maybe disagreements, and I'd be glad to comment after you have your thoughts on it.
That's correct, Mutt. I think one of the biggest maybe problems that we had to solve along the way was when we had our women's program in 71, and then in 76, the Old Dominion Athletic Conference was formed, and a lot of the smaller schools wanted to go into that in the state of Virginia. So that's your Hampton-Sydneys and your Guilfords, Guilford eventually came into it. Roanoke's, Bridgewater's, Washington Lee's, and so forth. And they wanted Randolph-Macon in it. But at that time, there were 3 sports at Randolph-Macon, and that's the 2 basketballs and men's soccer, that had a very vocal group of alumni and also coaches who did not want to give up scholarships. And in order to go into the Old Dominion Athletic Conference, you had to give up your scholarships. So this is what happened. Many meetings were held, and the bottom line was that those 3 sports I just mentioned were going to keep their scholarships and play as independents. The other sports were all going to give up their scholarships and go into the Old Dominion Athletic Conference. So this was in right around 1976. This created a couple of problems, though, in regard to the athletic administration. For one thing, whenever the athletic director or department chair went to a athletic NCAA meeting, sometimes these meetings split up so that you had Division I, Division II, and Division III meetings. We had sports in 2 of those divisions, and there was a question of which meeting would the athletic director go to, or which was the most meaningful to go to. So that created a nightmare for the athletic director. The other thing was scheduling. In Division II, you had to play Division II teams in Virginia, in North Carolina, in Washington, D.C., in Maryland, in Pennsylvania, and in New Jersey. And what finally happened was that the schools that we were playing in Division II were not the schools that had similar philosophies as Randolph-Macon. They didn't have the same academic situation. They were mostly larger schools, et cetera, et cetera. And this did not seem to work out very well. So I think later on in the early, I believe, 80s, other meetings were held at the college, and it finally was decided to put all their sports in Division III. Now, Mutt, you had one of the sports that at that time played as an independence. How did you feel about that at that time?
To be honest with you, I probably liked the Division II at first. I was probably one of those vocal people you're referring to. If you remember, football, baseball, and basketball had all the scholarship help that was given for all the sports at the college. And when we went to Division III, the football money and the baseball money was recouped, and the college accepted some of it, if I remember correctly, and then half it went to the women's basketball. The men's program may have gotten another additional. And soccer had a scholarship and a half. A scholarship and a half. That was a lot of money, Ted. Anyway, but it gave us enough money. We functioned a little bit differently at that time for financial aid at that time, because the college let us give money from the athletic on top of need, but the college would have to use their own money so we wouldn't break the rules. And so it did present some problems. The scheduling problem, as you mentioned, was one. But if you look back in soccer that you asked me about, that is when we were probably the most successful of all the time that we had. I had a full-time assistant in Jeff Burns. He was this head coach for women's soccer. It was very good. And then, of course, slowly the women's basketball program became to be one of the better ones in the country. So I was ready, to be honest with you, to go back to Division III, because the function under one umbrella was better than probably what we had. But I did enjoy the Division II days.
And I think you're right. You did have some really good teams during that period of time. But like you just said, overall, it's better to be under one umbrella. It makes things a lot simpler.
All right, I think we're almost getting towards the end of our talk, Ted. What I thought maybe would be good to maybe talk about your own successes and touch maybe on the women's teams in general.
Okay, I'll take the maybe guys and mention a few of their successes and good teams. I might start off in football, which was my sport. I know that we had some really good teams in the late 60s, and I think between 65 and 70, our record was something like 38-6, and that included a Eastern Division national championship. So that probably was the best that we had in football. We had some really good seasons after that, but none like this era. I'm going to let you talk about your own, Coach Werner, but I know you had some great soccer teams all over. In basketball, Paul Webb and Hal Nunley for decades had great teams. In fact, they had a runner-up national championship in '77, and you got to remember Hugh Stevens, who I think coached 33 years and had one losing season during that period of time. And we had Jim Blackburn, who took his team to the NCAA playoff in '84. And Greg Waters had many good baseball seasons. So you want to talk about the women a little bit and your team?
Just real quick, we've touched on a little bit. In soccer, to be honest with you, Ted, if I had a label, it'd probably be the bridesmaid. We came in second in most everything we ever played in, but our overall record was, I think, outstanding. One of the best probably in the country. But we won several state championships and so on. But on the women's side, right now in particular, we've gotten the women's basketball program to the point where they are every year a contender for the national playoffs, at least to get into it. And so they were very successful. The soccer, I already mentioned, Jeff Burns in particular did an outstanding job during his tenure, and we were always outstanding. There was a lacrosse team, I forget the year, that did real well. Carol LaHaye may have taken them to the national playoffs. And the other programs are all successful. It's just some are more so than others. Since we're ready to close up here, I thought one other thing that you might want to touch on is the idea where, when we talked about where scholarships ended and support for the college continued by alumni, and you were really at the heart of that a lot, and I'm referring to the Randolph-Macon Yellow Jacket Club. You want to maybe close out with that subject?
Well, I've got a couple more things I'd like to talk about, but that is one of them. The Yellow Jacket Club, which raised money for the athletic department, first was started by a person named Bill Ray, who was in Richmond, Virginia, and the Yellow Jacket Club actually started in Richmond. It was not a part of the college, so they handled their own funds and everything. When I took over as AD, I felt like that we need to rein in this group and bring them under the college umbrella, which we did. So they finally came under the supervision of the college, and starting back then, and this was quite a while ago, maybe 16, 18 years ago, we started out and we raised $10,000. As I understand now, in talking to Jeff Burns, who is the head of the Yellow Jacket Club now, we're close to $300,000, and the year hasn't even finished yet. So this is how it has progressed. But we sort of took it along, and we went baby steps, and finally we have somebody that was full-time. Back then, the AD only put about 5% of his time into the Yellow Jacket Club, so you couldn't expect that much. Hall of Fame, Mutt, do you talk about that, or you want me to talk about it?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at it, and I know, again, I think we both were involved in that, even though it was your idea, I think, originally. But that has been a good addition. Most schools today try to have a Hall of Fame and various rules and so on, which are not important here. But you have to have been out of college, I think, 10 years at Randolph-Macon to be in it.
That's
and you
correct.
and I both are fortunate enough to have been voted into it. They must have changed the rules a little bit. But I'll let you talk about that and finish up the discussion here today.
Well, I think back in 1996, that's when it started. We were a little late getting started because a lot of schools already had a Hall of Fame, but two alumni, Mac Feltz and David Yowers, I think, were the main instigators. I was in on it at some point, and we got a constitution during that time and started it up. And like you say, you have to be out of school 10 years, you have to be a letter winner, and you have to have made a contribution to the college. Right now, I believe we have 55 people in the Hall of Fame. We have 6 or 7 women, and the reason the women aren't, a lot of them aren't in there now, is because the women's program really didn't get started till the late 80s or mid-90s. Back, they started in 71, but they really didn't, have good teams for maybe 15 years or so. So there are 55, and that includes the 1969 football team, who was voted in as a team, and the 1977 basketball team that was runner-up in the NCAA. And every year we can take 4 people, living people, and 1 deceased. We have 9 on our board, which chooses the members, and we have 4 on our screening committee, of which Helmut and I are 2 members of the screening committee. And our last banquet, we had over 300 people attend. So It's getting big time.
Pretty successful.
Yeah, very successful.
Thank you very much. That concludes our interview with Coach Ted Keller and Coach Helmut Werner. Thank you.